Dan Machiela holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. He's the associate professor and also now chair of the Department of Religious Studies at McMaster University. His teaching and research interests are situated around history, literature, archaeology, and the social worlds of ancient Judaism, not least including the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is something we'll kind of dig into more in a bit. His published work has focused especially on the Qumran text and early Jewish interpretation of Scripture. Dan's 2009 edition and topical study of the Genesis Apocryphon have now become really a standard reference for any introduction or critical study of that text, as well as the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls. Currently, he's working on a multi-volume introduction to the scribal, linguistic, and literary world of the Aramaic text that will be out with Brill in the STDJ series, so keep an eye out for that. His publications extend into a long list, which I won't go into, of journal articles in JBL, Rabbinic Qumran, Dead Sea Discoveries, and you can keep Googling the list from there on out. As well as you may have seen a co-edited festschrift for Professor James Vanderkam, who's been here a number of times, who is his own advisor at Notre Dame. Dan's research in these areas and these projects has included grants from SSHRC, our Canadian funding body, the Albright Institute in Jerusalem, as well as the Humboldt Foundation in Germany. Since joining the faculty at McMaster, Dan has been a regular participant and supporter of Canadian Dead Sea Scroll studies at CSBS. I'm sure many of you actually met him there in the past year or so. So for all this reasons, it's good to have you on campus and on this side of the border and sharing the conversation with us. The paper Dan's going to share with us today is called Charity as a Theme in Some Qumran Aramaic Texts. So take it away. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker.
Okay, I think I'll just stand up, if it's all right, so that everybody can hear me okay. Thank you, Andy. Thank you all for coming. It is great to be here. I've known about Trinity Western for a long, long time, ever since I started to get interested in Dead Sea Scrolls. Trinity Western very quickly got on my map, and so I was just telling these guys on the way over that it's sort of in my mind looms very large, and it's just wonderful, wonderful to be here. And spend some time with all of you. So thank you for giving some time this morning. I imagine with Andy here that some of you might know that there are these things called the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a passion that Andy and I share, working on the Aramaic text from Qumran. And as Andy mentioned, a larger project of mine is working on this corpus. I started on one of the largest Aramaic texts from Qumran, the Genesis Apocryphon, which was found in Cave 1. 1947, and from there I went out and started reading the rest of the corpus. And when Andy was at McMaster, we did this together quite often. We would read these texts, and starting to do that, all of these lights started to go off and connections between these various texts, and in a very interesting way. And since then, I've just been fascinated by this corner of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not often the center of attention, but we're trying to push it a little bit more into the limelight because they're great texts. And one interesting thing is seeing where there's some overlap and interconnections between these various texts. So this is part of that broader project. It's just a little corner of it. So today I'm going to talk about charity as a theme in some Qumran Aramaic texts, and I'll read the paper. There's a fair bit of Aramaic and some Greek in here, but I'm providing translations as well, so you can look at whatever you want to in there, and then we can talk about things afterwards if you have questions about anything. So, let me go to the first slide. I'd like to begin my paper today by setting before you two images centered on the theme of charity. The first is William Blake's Nebuchadnezzar. This printing, one of three that are known to survive, is housed in Tate Britain, the National Gallery in London. In this image, the fallen beast-like Nebuchadnezzar symbolized Blake's critique of the idea of universal law and the political situation prevalent in the England of his day. For most of us, however, the image more readily calls to mind the biblical story on which it is based, found in Daniel 4, in which Nebuchadnezzar's debasement illustrates the folly of human hubris and pride, of not acknowledging that heaven rules. This is what it says in 4, verse 23. Daniel's interpretation of the king's dream makes clear that Nebuchadnezzar cannot avoid his punishment, but the advice of Daniel in 4, verse 24 provides a way for the king at least to prolong his prosperous condition. Here's the text. Therefore, O king, may my counsel be pleasing to you. Redeem your sin by almsgiving and your iniquity by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there will be a lengthening of your tranquility. Okay. I'm going to stay there for a minute. For readers of Daniel, Blake's print dramatically illustrates the loss of Nebuchadnezzar's tranquility, which is linked in some unexplained way to the sin and iniquity cited by Daniel. The importance and subsequent impact of this verse for the idea that charity, in Aramaic tzidkah, or the later or ancillary Hebrew is tzedakah, is reckoned against sin in some divine equation has been highlighted by Gary Anderson, Carol Newsom, and others. The specific sense of tzidkah as charity or almsgiving, rather than a more abstract meaning like righteousness, is helpfully clarified in our passage by the more precise poetic restatement of the concept with the words michan anayin, which Anderson translates as generosity to the poor. It's like compassion to the oppressed or something like that. You could translate it as well. Well, we do find a concept related to Daniel's at Proverbs 10 verse 2 and 11 verse 4 in the phrase Utzdaka tatzil mimavet, righteousness delivers from death. The specific meaning of tzidkah as a charitable act to the poor and oppressed is far less clear in Proverbs than in Daniel. Daniel 4 verse 24 then is the earliest clear attestation of the more specific meaning, dating to sometime during the late Persian or early Hellenistic periods. As noted by Anderson, tzedakah as almsgiving is unmistakable in the early 2nd century BCE Book of Ben Sira, and this becomes the primary meaning of the word by the rabbinic period. The fact that occurrences of the word in Daniel, Proverbs, and Ben Sira are taken to refer to giving alms by the early Roman period, and quite likely well before that time, is shown by the fact that tzidkah and tzedakah are subsequently translated into Greek by the word eleemosune. It is from this Greek word that the English word alms, or the German almosen, is derived, though eleemosune is often translated in English with the word charity. With regard to the Qumran texts, portions of Daniel 4 are extant in 4Q Daniel A and 4Q Daniel D, though in neither manuscript are the verses under discussion here preserved. My second image is a painting by the 17th century Italian master Machiela Preti, housed in Montreal. It depicts Tobit blessing his son Tobiah as the latter departs for Media with the disguised angel Raphael. So he's not very well disguised here with the wings sticking out. A poignant expression from the book of Tobit, quite commonly represented in medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque Christian art. The specific scene comes from near the end of Tobit 5, but the image captures the setting of Tobit's instructions to his son in chapter 4 as well. In that discourse, Tobit stresses several themes, but most prominent is the obligation of giving alms to the poor, which in 4 verse 9 to 10 is said to serve as, quote, a good treasure for yourself against the day of necessity, for almsgiving delivers from death and keeps you from going into the darkness, end quote. Later on, in 12 verse 9, Raphael adds an important detail while giving instruction to Tobiah, stating not only that almsgiving saves one from death, but also that it purges away every sin. The notion that charity to the poor directly counteracts sin links Tobit closely to Daniel. Finally, the book concludes with 2 examples showing the efficacy of charity. In 14 verse 2, we are told that Tobit died in peace, and that after regaining his sight, quote, he lived in prosperity, giving alms and continually blessing God and acknowledging God's majesty, end quote. Here, almsgiving and proper acknowledgement of one's position in relation to God are especially connected to Tobit's restoration and prosperity. We may note in this connection the climax of Daniel 4, at which Nebuchadnezzar, having been restored, exclaims, and I quote, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are truth and his ways are justice, end quote. Just as Tobit acknowledged God's majesty, so too does the restored, humbled Nebuchadnezzar. Later in the chapter, we learn that Tobit's nephew, Achikar, escaped a death trap laid for him by his crooked nephew, Nadab. Achikar's survival of Nadab's attempt is attributed to one thing, Achikar's practice of almsgiving. Tobit and Raphael taught that almsgiving saves from death and provides a good return for the practitioner, and the proof of this is given in chapter 14. The outcome of the Achikar and Nadab episode can also be seen as thematically related to Daniel 4, since almsgiving, tzidkah, is what wards off misfortune and ensures restoration for Achikar. Charity leads to life, light, and prosperity, but greed and pride to death, darkness, and shame. So, up to this point, I've highlighted the affinity and general outlook and specific terminology used by Daniel and Tobit regarding charity and its effectiveness vis-a-vis sin, something that has already been noted by others, most recently and persuasively by Anderson. What has not yet been sufficiently stressed, according to my knowledge, is that the agreement between Daniel and Tobit on the topic of charity coincides with a broader affinity in their literary character and compositional background, as texts composed in Aramaic during the Persian to Hellenistic periods eventually received among the writings at Qumran. In what remains of my talk, I will use this observation as a point of departure for exploring further the Aramaic word tzidkah in two other Aramaic texts from Qumran, the Aramaic Levi document and the Testament of Kahat. In doing so, I aim to make two central points. First, I will propose that the use of tzidkah in these two texts is complementary to its use with the meaning of charity given to the poor in Daniel and Tobit. I will then go on, second, to suggest that this common understanding of tzidkah as almsgiving serves to reinforce the idea, already proposed by Joseph Milik and several others, scholars after him, that much of the Aramaic literature at Qumran emerged from a common social milieu, sharing many literary features and topical themes. So the first text to which I turn is the Aramaic Levi document, and more specifically a wisdom poem situated near the end of that composition. The poem serves as a culmination of Levi's teaching, using the occasion of his brother Joseph's death to teach his sons how to conduct themselves in the world by holding up the example of Joseph's wise, upright behavior. The didactic setting is very similar to those already described from Tobit, especially chapter 4, where Tobit lectures Tobiah on proper conduct. Several manuscripts from Qumran preserve parts of Levi's poem, but it is 4Q213 that contains the lines of interest for our purpose. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. That was where the word tzidkah shows up in some of the Qumran manuscripts. So happily, the Codex of Aramaic Levi from the Cairo Geniza, now kept at Cambridge, overlaps with 4Q213 for the lines examined here, providing context critical to understanding this part of the poem. After a formulaic introduction, Levi begins the main content of his discourse as follows. Let the principle of all your deeds be truth, and may it accompany you forever. Sow almsgiving in truth, and you will reap a blessed and good harvest. For whoever sows good reaps good, and whoever sows wickedness, his planting returns to him. Let me just move this. I think I got a little shadow there. The overlapping portions of the Qumran and Geniza copies diverge only in small details, confined mostly to orthography and morphology, and we are forced to reconstruct but a very small portion of the text. There has been some disagreement over where to break the first and second lines in this part of the poem. R.H. Charles, followed by Greenfield and Stone, Beyer, and more recently Drovnell, placed the break between the words tzidkah and kushta at the beginning of my second line. So between these words here, they would break it there and put tzidkah up above, thereby making tzidkah a poetic synonym for kushta earlier in the first line. However, Greenfield and Stone later changed their minds, arguing instead that tzidkah and kushta act as a poetic doublet to open the second line, an arrangement later followed by Kugler, and that's the way I've got it up here. Both divisions are plausible on poetic grounds, but the matter is decided conclusively, in my opinion, by what is clearly a vakat, or a blank space, before the word tzidkah in 4Q213. This being the case, we might ask then, for the beginning of that line, why two words rather than one? Is this simply a poetic flourish, the author choosing to use two words that are roughly synonymous? Or is the hearer to glean something new from the addition of tzidkah to the two instances of kushta, or righteousness or truth, found in the preceding lines? Greenfield, Stone, and Eshel, Bayer, Kugler, and Drovnell agree in translating Kushta as truth, or Wahrheit in German for Bayer. And this is certainly a fitting translation of the word. As Armin Lange has shown, Kushta represents a concept of great importance in many of the Qumran Aramaic texts, covering a range of meanings connected to its core sense of something being straight, true, right, or just the way it ought to be. Kushta could also be plausibly translated here as uprightness or righteousness, Gerechtigkeit in German, since Levi obviously has a broad category of human conduct in view. As we shall see shortly, later Greek translators switched back and forth between these meanings when translating that word. However we translate Kushta, it is clearly a very important word in the Aramaic Qumran texts, and its meaning as a far-reaching notion of truthfulness or uprightness is well established. But what of tzidkata, or tzidka in the Geniza copy? Greenfield, Stone and Eschel, and Bayer translated it as righteousness, or Gerechtigkeit, while Kugler and Drovnell opted instead for justice, with all of them seeming to assume that tzidka is another abstract noun used as a partially overlapping synonym for kushta. These translations follow the traditional meaning of the noun as it was used in Biblical Hebrew, earlier Aramaic, and a number of the Hebrew compositions from Qumran. The result is two abstract nouns that seem to mean very nearly the same thing, both conveying the basic meaning of rightness or trueness. While this semantic overlap is certainly possible within the realm of poetry, I would like us to consider assigning tzidka the more specific meaning charity or almsgiving in the Aramaic Levi document, with the result that a greater conceptual distance exists between our two words than has been recognized to date, along with a closer relationship of the word tzidka as used in Daniel and Tobit. I offer two supporting reasons for this judgment. The first is simply that tzidka is an infrequent word in the Aramaic text from Qumran, bears the narrower meaning charity or almsgiving in Daniel and Tobit, both of which are close to the Aramaic Levi document in their outlook and language in other respects. In my opinion, we must first try to understand tzidka in Aramaic Levi by reckoning from our closest points of literary contact, and these are undoubtedly the other Jewish texts composed in Aramaic around the same time as Aramaic Levi. We may begin by observing that those who translated Daniel and Tobit into Greek during the Second Temple period clearly sensed a difference between the Aramaic words, tzidkata and kushta, since they consistently rendered them with distinctive Greek nouns, using eleemosune for the former, and either aletheia, truth, or dikeosune, righteousness, for the latter. The shift implied by these Greek translations is summed up well by Carol Newsom in her comments on Daniel 4, verse 24. She observes that, here's the quote, although the term tzidka has the broader meaning of righteousness, right conduct in earlier Aramaic, and its biblical Hebrew cognate, it comes to mean almsgiving. Here the parallelism with showing mercy to the poor indicates that it has the more specific meaning, and this is how both the Old Greek and Theodotion translate it. During the Second Temple period, almsgiving became the premier social virtue and was assumed to have general efficacy in softening the heart of the deity. In the book of Tobit, too, almsgiving is distinctly emphasized. In my opinion, Newsom's remarks are also applicable to Levi's inclusion of tzidka at the beginning of the instructions given to his sons, considering the shared literary background of Daniel, Tobit, and Aramaic Levi as Jewish Aramaic texts from roughly the same era. Beyond the analogous social context of fathers giving their sons ethical instruction in Tobit and the Aramaic Levi document, and Daniel similarly giving the king moral advice in the book of Daniel, I have time to submit only one further anecdote as evidence of this shared background. And the colors are meant to coordinate between these two passages. You can figure it out while I read up here. Hopefully it will become clear. In the Geniza copy of the Aramaic Levi document, Isaac says, "First of all, beware, my son, of every lewd behavior and impurity, and of every act of fornication. And you, marry a woman from my family, so that you may not defile your seed with fornicators, for you are a holy seed." Compare this with Tobit's counsel to Tobiah in the long Greek text of Tobit 4 verse 12. "Beware, my son, of every kind of fornication. First of all, marry a woman from among the descendants of your ancestors. Do not marry a foreign woman, who is not of your father's tribe, for we are descendants of the prophets. Though these statements are now preserved in different languages, their incredible similarity is easy to see even in English translation. In fact, a back translation of Tobit's Greek, based on what we know from the extant Aramaic of that book, renders the passage that is at a number of points identical to the phrasing of the Aramaic Levi document. My second reason suggesting that tzidkah means almsgiving in Aramaic Levi builds upon the first. Taking the general literary affinities of the Aramaic tales of Daniel, Tobit, and Aramaic Levi a step further by noting some more concrete similarities between the lines of Levi's poem under discussion here and the context of Tobit's teaching on almsgiving. Recall that Levi begins by emphasizing the connection between kushta, truth or uprightness, and deeds, what you do. Precisely the same connection is made by Tobit near the beginning of his discourse in 4 verse 5 through 7. Directly before he broaches the topic of almsgiving, or tzidkah, Tobit says, "Live uprightly all the days of your life, and do not walk in the ways of wrongdoing. For those who act in accordance with truth will prosper in all their activities. To all who practice righteousness, give alms from your possessions." In this NRSV English translation, the words uprightly and righteousness translate the same Greek word, dikaiosune, while truth translates aletheia. However, it is almost certain that behind both Greek words stood the Aramaic kushta. The conceptual and grammatical nearness of Tobit and Aramaic Levi can be seen in Levi's statement that making kushta, truth, the principle of all one's actions will result in it, quote, staying with you, unquote. And Tobit's claim that those practicing aletheia will benefit in all their actions. Note that in both cases, kushta or aletheia has lasting, tangible benefits for the practitioner. Notice also that eleemosune and dikaiosune or aletheia, that is to say, tzidkah and kushta, are tied very closely to one another in this passage from Tobit, even while eleemosune clearly means charity or almsgiving. If we turn to Raphael's teaching in Tobit 12, we find the same thing. There he says, "Prayer and fasting is good, but better than both is almsgiving and righteousness. Eleemosune meta dikaiosune. Tzidkah im kushta." In the following poetic pairing, Raphael again associates the two words. And I think this is still the same slide. Yeah. "A little with righteousness is better than wealth with wrongdoing. It is better to give alms than to lay up gold." I would submit to you that this is precisely the combination of concepts we find in Aramaic Levi. Finally, I note Levi's assertion that those who plant tzidkah and kushta will reap a blessed and good harvest, while those who plant evil will get the punishment they deserve. Raphael says nearly the same thing in the book of Tobit, but leaving aside the agricultural metaphor, when he advises that those who practice charity will live a satisfied life, but those who practice sin and wickedness are enemies of their own souls. Of course, we also see this made manifest in the case of Achicar and Nadav. Achicar gave alms and thereby saved his life from almost certain destruction, while Nadav acted wickedly and fell into his own trap. To use the language of Levi's poem, Achicar planted tzidkah and reaped a good harvest. Nadav planted evil and received back what he had sown. It is not coincidental that Tobit's last gasping words are, "So now, my children, see what almsgiving accomplishes and what injustice does. It brings death." That's 14 verse 11. If we understand Levi's use of tzidkah to mean almsgiving in the passage in front of us, he teaches precisely the same lesson to his children. So, having established, I hope, a credible connection between Tobit and the Aramaic Levi document regarding their teaching on uprightness and charity, I will now move on to deal much more briefly with the Testament of Kahat, 4Q 542. Even before its full publication by Emil Puesh in 1991, the Testament of Kahat, son of Levi, had been very closely associated with the Aramaic Levi document, and for good reason. These two texts, along with the visions of Amram, are clearly cut from the same cloth, sharing concepts, idioms, and idioms to such a remarkable extent that Millet believed they were viewed together in antiquity as a trilogy of works focused on the fathers of the Israelite priesthood. Whether or not Millet was correct in the details of his assessment, the relationship between Aramaic Levi and the Testament of Kahat has been established sufficiently for us to say that whatever tzidkah means in the former, it very likely means in the latter as well. The words appear twice in the two fragmentary columns of the Testament of Kahat that remain, in settings that recall those already discussed in Aramaic Levi, Tobit, and Daniel. The entirety of the extant text is a didactic address by Kahat to his children, and we first encountered tzidkah as part of a list of positive traits associated with Kahat and his ancestors. Here are the texts. Kahat has just warned his children about the dire consequences of handing over their ancestral inheritance to foreigners and those of mixed heritage, which would lead to Kahat's children being humiliated and subjugated. Therefore, grab hold, says Kahat, of the sayings of your father Jacob, and be strengthened by the rulings of Abraham and by the charitable deeds of Levi and of me. Puesh has suggested that din and tzidkah are synonyms, meaning decision, prescription, justice, or ordinance. While we might be tempted to think of Levi only in terms of priestly legal rulings based on the role of his family line in the Pentateuch, I would propose that portraying Levi and Kahat as paragons of charity is entirely in keeping with the tone of this literature, and of its extremely positive ethical depiction of Levi and his line. The second instance of tzidkah comes in a summative list of traits that constitute the ancestral inheritance just mentioned. Guard and follow the inheritance that your fathers left for you: truth, charity, uprightness, wholeness, purity, holiness, and priesthood. This is an impressive piling up of ancestral virtues, and we might immediately recognize the juxtaposition of kushta and tzidkah already seen in Aramaic Levi and Tobit. Once again, tzidkah could be assigned the abstract meaning righteousness or justice and fit well within the list. But in my opinion, the evidence of Daniel, Tobit, and Aramaic Levi recommends the narrower almsgiving or charity. So in drawing this paper to a close, allow me to reflect briefly on a few broader implications of this new take on the concept of charity in the Aramaic Levi document and the Testament of Kahat. What difference does it make? First, these texts add further force to Newsom's statement that during the Second Temple period, almsgiving became the premier social virtue of Judaism and was assumed to have general efficacy in softening the heart of the deity. All of the texts discussed in this paper adopt a didactic posture in presenting the concept of charity to their audience, inviting readers and listeners to place themselves in the position of those to whom the ancient sage is speaking. Daniel instructs the king to give alms in order to prolong his prosperity and redeem sin. Tobit and Raphael say much the same thing to Tobiah. Levi commands his sons to give alms, and Kahat, who was part of that audience, was evidently paying attention. In the Testament of Kahat, it is his turn to point out that he and his father practiced charity, urging his son to follow this example. By presenting Levi and Kahat as those who cared for the poor, those composing these texts were engaging in a practice common across the Qumran Aramaic texts focused on the patriarchs, such as the Genesis Apocryphon and Visions of Amram. They are using these venerated characters as canvases upon which to paint a new picture of wisdom and piety, which addressed new circumstances. These canvases were by no means blank to begin with, since they were already part of the Hebrew textual tradition, although there certainly was more upon which to build with characters like Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph than with Enoch, Levi, Kahat, and Amram. In all of these cases, however, ancestral heroes from Israel's past were recast, often with new or newly amplified attributes. The elaboration of charity as a virtue practiced by the patriarchs, and at a later time by the exilic characters of Tobit and Daniel, surely implies that charity was highly valued and widely promoted by those who wrote these texts during the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The reasons why this virtue was emphasized at this time is a point for further study. A second implication is that the related uses of tzidkah in the text discussed here extends the growing web of conceptual and lexical links among texts within the Qumran Aramaic corpus. There has been a growing discussion over the past decade of the extent to which we should think of these Aramaic works as forming an interrelated corpus, which promotes a coordinated view of the world for those associated with Israel and the Most High God. Based on the available comparative Aramaic evidence from the ancient Near East, using tzidkah to mean charity is a novel development from the more generalized meaning of merit or righteousness, as we also find in classical biblical Hebrew. This development first takes place in Daniel, Tobit, and, I would argue, Aramaic Levi document and Testament of Kahat. Alongside various other sources of evidence, the fact that all of these texts use tzidkah in a similar way at around the same time supports the notion that some Qumran Aramaic texts are products which emerged from the same Jewish social location. Finally, it is worth knowing that it is in this cluster of Aramaic texts that we first find tzidkah with a specialized sense of charity or almsgiving. As mentioned earlier, the meaning of the Hebrew equivalent in Proverbs 10 and 11 is ambiguous, though those passages were important for the development of the later concept, that almsgiving purges sin and saves from death. The other main witnesses to the more restricted sense of the word is Ben Sira, a Hebrew work that likely postdates all of the Aramaic texts discussed in this talk. We are left then with the observation that the shared rabbinic and early Christian notion of care for the poor, tzidkah and elet mosune, still influential in many Christian and Jewish communities today, made its first appearance among a handful of Qumran Aramaic texts addressed to the people of Israel during the Second Temple period. Thank you very much.